race towards the heavens, each an impressive tribute to their creator's imagination. Some carry the hopes and dreams of a nation.
Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
All are a showcase for the sweat and toil of the people who build them. But, as they say, what goes up must come down. And sometimes the journey is cut short in an often tragic, almost always unpredictable instant.
You can't provide for every conceivable contingency because it's always going to be the one thing that nobody imagined could possibly happen.
The stories behind the most spectacular rocket failures and how they altered the course of rocket science, coming up next on Rocket's Red Flare. For the past 60 years, some of the best minds on the planet have been devoted to designing, building, and launching rockets into space. But despite the often extraordinary effort, it's never been an easy task.
One of the things that's frequently overlooked about spaceflight is how absolutely miraculous it is that it ever works at all. This is the most difficult, the most challenging thing that humanity has ever attempted.
With that in mind, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that even for rocket scientists, the greatest leaps forward have been accompanied by disheartening failures.
2, 1, 0.
The thing about rocketry is, of course, when the failures happen, they're incredibly spectacular.
In less than a century, rocketry has progressed from inventor Robert Goddard tinkering in his New England barn to giant Titans, Deltas, and Atlases carrying huge payloads into space. But every science is still a human exploration. So with achievements come risk.
That's one of the things that is very, very important in this business, is that you learn from your mistakes. If you're not allowed to fail, then by definition you cannot succeed.
Problems ranging from sloshing fuel that throws a rocket off balance,
Looking good out of 100 feet.
to a prototype's landing system failing to deploy. Whatever the cause, rocket failure is usually dramatic in nature. Packed with explosive fuel, with a tremendous amount of money poured into development and execution, rockets almost always fail in costly and fantastic fashion. One of the most spectacular failures occurred on August 12, 1998, when this Titan IV became the most expensive unmanned rocket failure in the history of flight. Tucked into the 20-story tall, $350 million Titan was a billion-dollar spy satellite that was as large as a school bus. At 7:30 a.m., Air Force Captain Brian Chappell and his launch crew watched as the rocket slowly rose from its pad.
And it's always an adrenaline rush to see hard work finally come to fruition. You're hoping and praying that everything goes correctly because, you know, with Titan we had 185 days typically to launch the rocket, to build it and launch it. So you're hoping and keeping your fingers crossed that everything goes well.
For the first 30 seconds, everything went according to plan. Then, 40 seconds after liftoff, Chappelle watched in shock as the rocket took a slight, unexpected roll. The Titan IV pitched down and instantly exploded.
When I saw the rocket explode, I just said, oh my God. It just went up in the air and exploded. And to see anything fail, you feel for the guys that are involved with launching it, with building up the rocket, because there's so much time and sacrifice that we put into launching this rocket.
The force of the blast set off car alarms 12 miles away and sent engineers racing back to the drawing board to determine the cause of the accident. Ironically, like a loose synapse in an otherwise brilliant mind, the cause of the explosion was traced to a single stripped wire. As the rocket lifted off, the bare wire vibrated into its metal casing and shorted out, and with that, it shut down the rocket's entire guidance system.
That short caused a power outage, if you will, in the guidance set. So the rocket's trying to fly a specific path, but what occurred was every time that wire would short, it would do this. This is a hugely complex operation. You cannot make these things an absolute perfect machine every time.
The single stripped wire in the Titan IV underscored a much larger problem plaguing the rocket industry. Modern rockets are built by private companies that compete to carry satellites into space. To keep the Titan IV competitive, there was pressure on engineers to cut costs. And we all know if pressure grows too great, sometimes things snap.
Unfortunately, they made some bad choices. They cut back some of their safety and quality assurance workforce. They reduced the number of inspections, and ultimately those practices caught up with them, resulting in the loss of $1 billion intelligence satellite.
We have ignition and liftoff.
There are two basic types of rocket failures. Those caused by complacency and neglect when a rocket program is successful, and those caused by the countless kinks that must be ironed out when a rocket program is new. Before that happens, many lessons, often harsh, must be learned. The projectile that put engineers through the ultimate crash course was the legendary German creation called the V2.
It was the Germans who made this technological leap from small rockets up to something that could lift a warhead 200 miles.
Nazi Germany first launched the V2 in 1942. At 46 feet, it was as tall as a 4-story building, and by the end of World War II, it would be carrying bombs across the English Channel to London. But many lessons had to be learned before it could rain down its deadly payload onto unsuspecting English citizens. During its genesis, the V2 suffered seemingly every imaginable type of malfunction.
Were every reason under the sun. One typical problem was the engine would start and then it would cut off. Very often just above the launch pad. Guidance problems were typical. Guidance problems included everything. Jet vanes that didn't work, electronic failures, you name it. I think it just shows you how fragile and new this technology was.
The V2 was blowing itself all over the landscape because it was new. I mean, every nut and bolt in that thing was not only invented from scratch, but under intense pressure from the Nazi government to get this thing built and flying right now.
Despite its early problems, the V2 ultimately would serve as a revolutionary prototype for the modern rocket designs that followed. the Nazi engineers who designed the V-2, including their leader, Wernher von Braun, would eventually emigrate to the United States after the war. After their discovery of the V-2 in 1943, pressure was on for U.S. engineers to develop their own rocket. Working around the clock at what would become NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, they produced the Corporal. Rocket engineer David Altman was there in 1945 for the first test.
I remember going down to White Sands, New Mexico for the maiden flight of the Corporal. Of course, they didn't have any bunk houses and no protective places from which you watch. So we're standing out in the field, and there we saw the noise, and the flames are coming out of the bucket. It's not taking off. We're sitting looking at it, looking at each other, and after about 30 seconds, slowly it started taking off. Going up in the air, went around in a bit of a circle, came down and crashed on the ground, maybe a couple hundred feet from us.
Altman and his fellow engineers emerged from the close call unscathed and unraveled the mystery behind the crash. The power to propel the rocket came from a volatile mixture of fuel and liquid oxygen that had to be cooled to a frigid negative 300 degrees. The extreme temperature caused a single valve to freeze shut, discharging the Corporal well before its full tour of duty. After World War II, the race to dominate the skies gave birth to new rockets powerful enough to carry the enormous hydrogen bomb.
There was a real fear that the Soviets had a lead in ballistic missiles. We had to catch up. They had to make a number of leaps technologically to make something that could go 1,500 miles instead of 200 miles.
In those early years, flight tests sometimes demonstrated that the most complicated problems could be fixed with the simplest solution. Take, for instance, the Jupiter rocket. A team of engineers led by Wernher von Braun designed the Jupiter, and ultimately the rocket made its creators proud. But the first steps of Jupiter's evolution were shaky.
It didn't have fins. That meant that the vehicle was aerodynamically unstable. The engine now swiveled instead of having vanes in the exhaust. That was new. The guidance system was more elaborate. If the engine swiveling wasn't accurate, it would get off course and blow up. So there's many things that could go wrong.
Henry Pohl worked on the Jupiter and remembers the early failures.
The propellant started sloshing in the propellant tanks. The gimbal system on the rocket engine started pushing the rocket back and forth to keep it on course, and the propellant started sloshing. And it sloshed bad enough to where it broke up. It just came apart. That's very disheartening to put all the time and effort in there. And it's worse if it's the second or third time that happened.
Engineers moved quickly to find a solution to the explosive predicament.
We came up with some little aluminum balls with a little tail on them, and we filled the tank up with those things. And we launched 3 or 4 of them with that, without any failures. And then we put slosh baffles inside the tank after that. And every rocket since then have flown with slosh baffles in them to keep the propellant from sloshing.
As the Cold War heated up in the 50s, the U.S. Air Force, Army, and Navy all responded to the Soviet threat by quickly developing their own version of rockets to deliver the bomb. But despite impressive progress, they encountered spectacular failures.
Everything was rush, 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 crash program, get it done today, deploy this thing as soon as possible. You know, we're afraid of the nuclear war with the Soviet Union.
Can't cut corners with, engineering because physics, has no respect for politics. So if you don't take the time to do things properly, then they'll blow up. did a lot.
In 1957, the Air Force introduced the Atlas, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, designed to carry an H-bomb from the U.S. all the way to its target in the Soviet Union. It was the biggest, longest-range rocket that had ever been built.
Atlas had a great deal of problems because Atlas really pushed the edge of the envelope. Atlas was the most radical design. They pushed that missile technology to the edge of what was possible in the 1950s, and therefore Atlas had a really problematic record when they started launching it.
These rockets were really designed the old-fashioned way. A bunch of guys sitting in a room with paper, pencils, slide rules, hand calculators. Their ability to simulate how these rockets would perform was quite rudimentary, and so they had to do a tremendous amount of flight testing in order to understand how they would work.
The Atlas failures could be traced to two primary causes. First, the Atlas featured 3 engines, which meant there were 3 times as many things that could go wrong, which usually did.
That was the first time we had used 3 engines at the same time to power a vehicle. We had previously used a single engine to power our vehicles, and that caused us much more difficulty than we had previously had.
Inside a rocket engine, you've got enormous stress and power, temperatures of thousands of degrees, pressures of hundreds to thousands of pounds per square inch. You've got to be able to insulate the engine shell from melting because the temperatures of the gases inside the engine are hotter than the melting point of the metal.
The second problem was the distance the Atlas had to fly. To deliver its deadly payload, the Atlas had to have an exquisitely precise yet efficient guidance system.
It was supposed to travel 5,000 or 6,000 miles, and it had to hit a target, and so the guidance system takes into account the fact that you have a wind coming on the side that's pushing it a little bit, and then you have to correct it. If you don't do it properly, then it starts tipping.
And in the world of rockets, tipping almost always has catastrophic consequences.
Any rocket is a fragile device because it's got to be mostly fuel, essentially an empty shell full of fuel.
To limit its weight, the designers of the Atlas made the sides of their rocket paper thin, using metals similar to today's soft drink cans. So the result was that the 13-story tall Atlas, which weighed in at over 132 tons, consisted almost entirely of fuel. September 24th, 1959. A static booster test. The Atlas is held firmly to the pad while its engines are fired to test the rocket before the all-or-nothing commitment of a launch. But when the fuel tank unexpectedly ruptures, the resulting explosion incinerates the pad. As the Cold War clutched the world in its icy embrace, the U.S. Air Force developed the Thor. Named after the god of thunder, the Thor rocket was supposed to deliver a lightning-swift atomic message to its unlucky target. But things got off to a rocky start. On January 25th, 1957, the Thor 101 stood ready for its maiden flight. Years of painstaking development were blown away in an instant, all apparently because of an object smaller than an ant.
When you are in college, you might take English 101, you might take French 101, so Thor 101 was just that same kind of introductory type of attempt. Now what happened there was that there was a check valve within the plumbing of the rocket system, and that check valve was supposed to slam shut at liftoff.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
But it didn't. Tiny grains of sand kept the valve from completely closing, and fuel drained from the line, causing the rocket to lose its power.
They found where a fellow was dragging a hose through sand. They began to say, hey, maybe there were some little grains of sand that stuck to the hose, just big enough to damage that check valve. They did tests on the ground, and sure enough, they duplicated that failure.
The failure of the Thor 101 underscores the often minuscule problems rocket engineers grapple with in their work.
Thor was really a very simple device. And it did not have unusual problems. It had problems, not unusual ones. There were two major elements in development that an awful lot of people forget. One is serendipity, and the other is failure.
Problems with the Thor rockets did not stop with the explosion of the 101. This later variation had its pump jam, which suddenly stopped fuel from being sent to the engine. No fuel, no thrust. No thrust, no height. No height, disaster. Compounding problems was the Thor's accelerated production schedule.
You got a production line going, and you're turning out maybe one a week off the line. And there's a significant delay from the time it's built until you get it down to the cave. By the time you get it set up, get it ready to launch, and then you have a failure on it. Well, you got 3 or 4 more in the pipeline. It may be 3 or 4 of them after they had a failure before they would catch up with a fix on it. And they would learn something from the others, so they just kept on launching them. I remember one year down there when I think they lost 15 Thors in a row down there.
In October 1957, the Soviet Union sent the U.S. rocket program reeling into new, uncertain territory with one prodigious blast. In a word, Sputnik. The U.S. rocket program had been blindsided. A humiliated U.S. scrambled to get their own satellite into space. It was determined they would use this, a 3-stage rocket called the Vanguard. They put a grapefruit-sized satellite in its nose cone and started the countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff.
The problem with the Vanguard blowing up is that everybody in the world saw it live on TV. And it's hard to think now how much prestige we felt we lost. We saw that happen. Russia launching satellites into space, for heaven's sakes, far ahead of us, who were supposed to be the technological leaders of the world.
In principle, the Vanguard program should have been reasonably successful because all of the stages in the Vanguard program had been previously tested. The problem was that they had not been previously tested together, and basically it was an accident waiting to happen, which is in fact what did happen.
As the Vanguard lifted off, its engines shut down. Americans watched as the hopes of a nation blew up before their very eyes. Fortunately for the country, the U.S. Army helped restore our wounded pride less than 2 months later. They put a satellite into orbit using a Jupiter C rocket designed by Wernher von Braun and his team.
A project like firing a satellite into orbit is only possible if there's splendid teamwork all the way through.
But America's volatile relationship with the rocket was far from over. On July 16, 1959, this Juno 2 rocket was carrying another satellite into orbit when moments after liftoff, its guidance system failed. The rocket took a sudden turn directly towards a gathering of the nation's press sitting in the stands.
You had a lot of people from the news media who were there to watch that launch, and some of their people who had cameras took the world's best photos of the business end of a missile heading in their direction.
Fortunately, no writer's obituary had to be written that day. Then, on April 12, 1961, the bar in terms of rocket flight was dramatically raised once again. With little warning, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, soon to be called the Columbus of the cosmos, climbed into a Vostok 1 capsule on top of a Russian rocket and was launched into orbit for a 108-minute flight. Overnight, the manned space race had begun. Now, engineers not only had to successfully launch rockets, they had to do it with a human payload. When it came time to choose an American rocket powerful enough to slingshot a man into space, the choices were few. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, taking a 15-minute flight on a Redstone rocket. But to launch John Glenn into Earth's orbit, a much longer flight, engineers chose the larger Atlas, a rocket infamous for its spectacular failures in the past.
Oh, everyone was concerned because the Atlas, one out of every 3 Atlases was failing at the time. But there were a lot of Atlas failures prior to the time Glenn went up. So it was pretty touchy.
It did concern me that manned missions using Atlas could be dangerous. You don't really like to have key missions on top of very, very fragile equipment. And Atlas is a fragile design. But the only device you could use to put man in space was the Atlas. So whether it was thin-skinned or not, you had no variety possible. Because politically it was scheduled.
With the air thick with anxiety, just 6 months before John Glenn's scheduled flight, this Atlas was rolled onto the pad at Vandenberg Air Force Base. At 28 minutes past noon, the Atlas's 3 rocket engines fired. Seconds later, they exploded.
These were just the ballistic missiles used for launching nuclear warheads. They put guys on top of them. That was as simple as that. And particularly with the Atlas, even the astronauts were very concerned because they were taken out to the launch pad and watched unmanned Atlas tests blow up.
As Glenn's launch approached, NASA officials knew that there was tremendous pressure to address the growing concerns over a possible deadly catastrophe.
NASA put great effort into bringing the astronauts to the plant, saying, hey guys, you know, our butts are on the line here. We're going to be riding this missile. Please take care.
But in the end, John Glenn, with the expectations of a nation upon him, took that important leap of faith. He bravely climbed into his capsule and let the engineers light the fuse.
Go! Engine start! Roger, feels good. Through max Q and smoothing out real fine. Oh, that view is tremendous.
I think the bottom line is that America was very lucky. I think we were basically beating the odds. At the time, launch vehicle accidents were occurring every dozen, 2 dozen launches. I think that they just got lucky that the Atlases that they were flying didn't blow up the way some of the other rockets did.
As the goals of the rocket program became greater, the missions grew longer. With larger loads and longer distances weighing heavier on NASA, the heavy-lift Titan rocket not only provided a more popular choice for space missions, but also provided us, at least in one instance, a glimpse into the type of courage it takes to be an astronaut. On December 12, 1965, astronauts Wally Schirra and Thomas Stafford were sitting on top of this Titan II rocket, getting ready to rendezvous with another capsule already in space.
You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, adios. Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
But 2 seconds after ignition, the rocket's engines mysteriously shut down.
Slowly. Roger, Jim.
They were supposed to eject, but that would have scrubbed the whole mission. So instead, they did the hardest thing of all. Nothing.
So you talk about astronauts staying cool in a crisis. How'd you like to be on top of a rocket that might fall over, and it's full of not only explosive, but actually corrosive fuel that will actually dissolve the bones in your body? And you just sit there and you got that ring that you would pull to eject, and you just don't pull that ring. That's how astronauts earn their money.
On my mark, 20 seconds.
The astronauts' precarious predicament was caused by a small electrical plug in the tail of the rocket that had simply dropped out of its socket. 3 days later, the plug replaced, Schirra and Stafford courageously climbed back into their capsule, safely lifted off, and accomplished their mission. On the 4th of July, 1969, it was the Russians who put on the world's largest fireworks display. The N-1 rocket was their last hope to win the race to the moon. With 30 separate engines, the N-1 was so enormous, a special pad had to be built to accommodate its launch. But when a stray piece of metal fell into a fuel pump, one engine exploded and the rest began to shut down.
It actually burns like a blowtorch going through hot butter through 5 floors, 46-foot underground facility, leveling and destroying that entire launch pad.
It was a costly humiliation for the Soviets.
10, 9, ignition sequence start.
Just 2 weeks later, on July 16, 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins lifted off from Cape Canaveral and were propelled into the history books. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin would be walking on the moon. The massive Saturn V that took them there was the largest, most powerful rocket ever built, standing 36 stories high and consuming 23 tons of fuel just to start its engines. Tellingly, Wernher von Braun, the Uber engineer who had created Germany's pioneering V-2 rocket 25 years earlier, led the group who designed the Saturn V. Those early failures and the lessons they taught rocket engineers played a key role in the Saturn V's creation. 25 years of rocket failure provided the tough but necessary education that put a man on the moon.
Roger, Columbia. You've got your normal Capcom back now.
The desire of engineers to push the envelope is just half the story behind why rockets fail. Often, simple complacency can creep into a rocket program after a string of successes and wreak unsuspecting havoc. For the U.S., over time, reliability began to breed a false sense of security. As America sped toward the 21st century, it began to expect perfection in the manned rocket program. But all that confidence and bravado came crashing down on January 28, 1986.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
On that tragic day, a horrific disaster demonstrated the folly of our complacency.
It's a whole different thing watching, say, an Atlas blow up or watching Vanguard blow up. It's a different thing when there's people sitting on top of this thing.
We are now waiting word from an any recovery forces in the downrange field.
I think the Challenger was certainly a lesson that a lot of people had to learn, unfortunately, at the cost of 7 lives, which was that these problems don't go away even though you're confident in your technology.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
The major lesson that came out of the Challenger failure, in my mind, is the fact that you need to listen to what the data is telling you. You know, we knew early on that we had a very weak design on that O-ring, and we could have fixed it very easily, very quickly, if we would just recognize the seriousness of it and took adequate steps to correct it.
In the months that followed the Challenger explosion, both of the U.S.'s other rocket programs, the Delta and the Titan, suffered similar fates.
America's space program was completely grounded in 1986. Probably the most significant from the military's perspective was the Titan 34D.
April 18th, 1986, just 12 weeks after the Challenger explosion, the Titan 34D and the spy satellite it was carrying were both destroyed 8.5 seconds after liftoff from Vandenberg Air Force Base.
Liftoff. Liftoff of Delta 178 and the GOES-G satellite.
Less than 3 weeks later, this Delta lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida. 71 seconds later, its main engine failed. Sailors who were still on the sea searching for debris from the Challenger disaster had to steer their ships in a new direction to look for the downed Delta.
We show a premature main engine shutdown.
Within 4 months, the United States' 3 largest rocket programs had failed.
Nobody expected these failures. They came out of the blue, and coming at the same time as the shuttle accident, I think it really threw the government and the industry folks for a loop because they were so proven. It was a mindset issue of, oh my God, how did we screw up here?
The answer to how such a series of failures could take place was readily apparent. The individual problems that grounded the Titan, the Delta, and the Space Shuttle were eventually fixed, and all 3 rockets began flying again. 1986 brought to light a truth about the world of modern rockets. Rockets are incredibly complex and surprisingly delicate machines. Unless they are operated with the highest levels of quality control and have a little bit of good fortune to help them along, they will always be susceptible to failure. And when they fail, the costs can be enormous. As the rocket age now matures and engineers perfect their craft, fewer and fewer failures take place.
Part of it is that a lot of the rockets we're still launching are essentially later developed versions of rockets that were built in the 1950s. On the other hand, new failures constantly prove, the axiom that you can't be too complacent, and when you're dealing with a technology as expensive and risky and fragile as this, you can't ever expect it to be 100% perfect.
In 1997, one of the most reliable rockets, the Delta, had an excellent success rate. Just 1 failure in every 50 launches, with most of those occurring decades ago. Nevertheless, on January 17, 1997, this Delta mission would become one of the most spectacular failures in rocket history. At 11:28 a.m., the engines fired, and the Delta rocket, carrying a new global positioning satellite, lifts off flawlessly. But only 8 seconds after takeoff, smoke erupts from one of the solid rocket boosters. 7 seconds later, the main fuel tank blows.
We have had an anomaly.
The force of the blast is heard 25 miles away. 254 tons of fuel and debris rain down from the heavens.
There was some kind of damage to the casing of that solid rocket motor. It caused that solid rocket, after it lifted off, to rupture longitudinally for about 11 feet down the side of it. Speculation was that there was some damage to the outside of the casing once it had left the factory, and that's all it took.
To this day, the exact cause of the booster damage is a mystery. Whether it was accidentally hit by a worker or mistakenly bumped during shipping, no one will ever know. You can't always put a face on human error.
The effects of quality control are much more difficult to manage. When you have a quality control problem in the launch vehicle business, you normally only discover that fact when you have a multi-hundred-million-dollar explosion on television.
Weighed in human costs, it is the Chinese who have paid the highest price for their rocket failures. To compete for their share of the satellite business, the Chinese government developed the Long March, a 421,000-pound rocket standing 92 feet tall.
The Chinese space program is entirely different than the U.S. program, the European program, even the Russian program. And much of their program was under very, very Spartan and tough circumstances. They were basically trying to build rockets at a time when they were also trying to feed their people under famine conditions.
On January 26, 1995, this Long March 2 lifted off from its pad in rural China, with curious local villagers looking on in awe. Within seconds, it had strayed off course and exploded. 6 villagers perished when it crashed near the pad. But that was just a precursor to an even more tragic event 1 year later. On February 14, 1996, the Long March 3 rocket sat on the very same pad as its ill-fated predecessor. Immediately after liftoff, it was clear the rocket was not going to go where its makers wanted it to go. The rocket came crashing to Earth just seconds after launch. Initial reports of the failure's impact were murky, as foreign observers were kept sequestered in a bunkhouse for 5 hours before being released. This footage was taken secretly from a bus as visitors were whisked away from the disaster site.
You see the soldiers standing there, but they had to then go out and do cleanup in a massive rural area. I think that explains why they needed this 5-hour time period to get it looking as good as it did, to then shuffle the foreign visitors through and get them out.
As the reports trickled out, the world soon became aware of an unprecedented human catastrophe. Observers estimate as many as 500 innocent people were killed in the accident.
That certainly makes it the worst space launch accident in terms of loss of life, and even more than earlier Russian accidents. These were rural villagers. These were just people who happened to live in the area.
The Chinese government blamed the rocket's failure on an unexpected gust of wind. In light of recent failures, it's apparent that rocketry is still far from an exact science.
Spaceflight is an inherently risky business. I think that for the foreseeable future, rockets are going to continue to blow up. I think it's safe to assume that the odds of failure are going to continue to be somewhere between 1 in 10 or 1 in 20.
I remind you that the Wright brothers only flew in 1903. So here we are less than 100 years from the Wright brother, and I think we've made some tremendous progress. We understand the physics of launch. We know how to get to 22,300 miles in a geosynchronous orbit. We know how to put a man on the moon, and we know how to go to Mars, and we know how to go out beyond the solar system. Failures that we have seen have not been necessarily a result of the technology development as much as it has been perhaps human error.
Failure is something you just have to accept with technology. We reach this plateau in general where rockets are quite fairly reliable, and there will be continuing efforts to make them nearly 100% reliable, but you just have to expect failure. I mean, no technology that humans build is completely 100% safe every single time.
So, as these rockets speed toward the final frontier, carrying the hopes and dreams of those below, so too is fate always a passenger. Too often in the past, failure, spawned by everything from simple malfunction to foolish complacency, has cut short a glorious journey. It is the price we have had to pay to pursue our bold quest, a voyage of discovery that in the end, despite catastrophe and tragedy, has allowed mere mortals to walk above the clouds.